we have time for one other quick one before the program actually begins. And this piece, I gotta find out what the real name of it is because.
Can alla Rossini.
Huh?
Can alla Rossini.
It's called Can alla Rossini. Now, the thing about this piece is that it's got close to 30 different songs in it. And some of them you'll recognize and some of them you won't recognize. But this is a whole collection of things that you may or probably have heard. So it's some junction. So this is Rossini alla Can. And the Can is in there someplace, and there's some Rossini in there someplace, but there's a whole lot of other stuff. So we hope you enjoy this. And in just a second.
She's gonna can.
We'll be right with you. Oh. This is nothing serious. We forgot a page of music.
If anyone has a second clarinet part.
But only page one, we
Only page one. We got the second.
She doesn't know I like the band. I think I'll go ahead and speak for a minute while she's getting that page. Here she comes, but I'm going to speak to you now anyway because I got the mic. I'm Dave Bailey. I'm I'm not full-time faculty, but I'm one of the music people here at Nashoba Regional. And I've been directing the Nashoba Symphonic Band it'll be 10 years in the fall. And next year will be our 10th anniversary year, and I'll talk to you more about that. This is the first of 3 performances that all sort of fit together under the title of the Wolves of Nashoba. When we first started thinking about this over a year ago, it happened that Joe McCarthy, who's the head of the music department, and I were talking, and we decided that after 10 years we should have a piece that we could go to a composer and get a person to write a piece for us. And we came up with the idea that since we have a new mascot with the Nashoba Wolves rather than the Native American sort of thing that we're trying to move away from, that we should have something, and with the new high school being built, that we should have something that sort of highlighted the idea of the wolves. And so we got talking, and and we talked to this composer, and he's written us this gorgeous piece, which we will be performing on Sunday. So this is the first, and so it also got us thinking about what wolves are and why that's sort of important. And so we came up with a series of some thoughts on that. And the first was that just a word about the symphonic band. It's the only band, at least in Massachusetts, it's the only school in Massachusetts that has a school-sponsored band which is made up of students, faculty, parents, brothers and sisters, and community members. That's part of the school regular music curriculum. And it just isn't done anyplace else. And we were so happy to be able to bring the entire community into this whole project. And we started thinking about wolves and the idea of the wolves. And when they first were picking a a mascot, the sports people and everything got to talking about wolves, but not wolves so much as not so much as a predator and all of that sort of thing, and go wolves and we're going to get them and on the field and all this stuff, but wolves as protectors, and wolves as looking out after one another as a family, and protecting one another and looking after and nurturing and taking care of other young wolves and everything. And so the whole thing developed into just thinking about this whole thing as wolves, as on sort of the better side of them, and how they act as a family. And then I got to thinking, well, it's kind of the same with music and the arts in general in a school system. The arts are different than like the everyday subjects, the math and the history and that sort of thing, in the sense that you have kids that start in music way early on, and they follow it all the way through high school and some into college and adulthood. But the whole idea is that they look after it, it becomes part of their family. It becomes a music family or an art family or a drama family. And so we're much the same, and that's kind of what we're looking at. And I'll throw in one personal note. When I was growing up, my dad had a job that required him to move from place to place to place, just because he was in government printing, and it just that was, you didn't stay in one place for long. So I went to three different high schools, but because I was a tuba player, I'm sorry, did I admit that? I was a tuba player, and I was sang in the chorus, and so I would go from school to school, and I was always welcomed, because I was part of that. I was part of the music family. And so once you're in the music family, you're in your arts family, in the sports family, and anything that just draws them into their own, you become part of a greater family. So that's what this Wolf Festival is about. And we thought that the best way to open the series was to talk about local history and embracing history as part of our own. So tonight we're talking about local history. Tomorrow night we'll be doing the Devil and Daniel Webster as a radio play. The Devil and Daniel Webster took place like 20 miles up north of here, and it's kind of a story about that. And then Sunday at 3:00 is our concert, where we are going to do the world premiere of The Wolves of Nashoba. And so I hope you join us for all of the events. And I just wanted to say a couple of words of introduction. And we're the Nashoba Symphonic Band. I think we're a family, but we're a part of a greater family of Nashoba Public Schools, of our entire surrounding communities. So we hope you enjoy everything that you hear from the speakers tonight, and anything else you come to. So we will play this one piece for you, and then we will get started. If we have do we have everything now? We don't. Okay, we'll do it. Okay. in there. I haven't found them all yet. Every time I play it, there's like one or two more. There's just a little snippet of it, and there it jumps. Well, I would like to now it takes great pleasure if I can. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the Special Collections and Archive Librarian from Thayer Memorial Library, Victoria Hatchell. So.
Hi, as I was introduced, I'm Victoria Hatchell. I'm the Special Collections and Archives Librarian at Thayer Memorial Library in Lancaster. And tonight I'm going to be talking about two well-known local captivity narratives, the story of Mary Rowlandson, America's first best-selling author, and Elias Sawyer, whose captivity supposedly included a tragic romance with an Indian maiden. But first, what is a captivity narrative? Captivity narratives, in simplest terms, are personal accounts of people who are taken captive by some sort of enemy. In New England, this usually involves European or American colonists being taken captive by indigenous peoples. The prospect of being captured was not something foreign to New England colonists and was a very real aspect of their lives. During the colonial period, which is roughly 1600 to 1800, thousands were taken captive in New England alone. One historian puts her estimates of those taken in the French and Indian War to be about 750 based on records, although it is likely that more were taken. Another survey suggests that over 1,600 New England settlers were captured by Native Americans between 1675 and 1763. And the reason behind taking captives often varied. Sometimes it was for purposes of revenge, other times it was lucrative. Selling or ransoming captives back to their families was an easy way to get supplies and see a release of indigenous captives. But captivity narratives as a genre of literature are very complex, despite on the surface being simple. And Lancaster is known for one of the most famous, if not the most famous, of all captivity narratives ever written, the Mary Rowlandson narrative. Published in 1682 in Boston, The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, or A True History in the 1682 London edition, according to scholars, was the earliest full-length account to be published as a single book. It became a bestseller overnight. It contained all the structural elements that eventually characterized the captivity narrative. It established itself as the first indigenous American literary form. It was a rare example of a publication by a Puritan woman, especially in prose rather than poetry, and it rapidly obtained a reputation as a perennially popular classic. But who was Mary Rowlandson? Mary Rowlandson, born Mary White in Somerset, England, around 1637, first moved to Salem in 1639 when she was roughly 2 years old, before moving to Lancaster around 1653 as one of the first families to settle the area. Around 1656, she married Joseph Rowlandson, the town's first ordained minister. They had 4 children: Mary, born in 1657 but who died young in 1660, Joseph, born in 1661, a second Mary in 1665, and finally Sarah in 1669. We can assume that she lived a typical life as a Puritan colonist before her captivity and her rise to fame as an author. Her narrative begins on the morning of the Lancaster raid, February 10th, 1676, the 350th anniversary of which is next year. At the time of the start of King Philip's War in June of 1675, there were more than 50 colonial families living in Lancaster, or about 350 people. 25 to 30 families of Nipmuc or Nashoba peoples, about 150 to 180 people. Tensions had been rising between colonists and Native Americans leading up to 1676, with overhunting, decrease in native population due to European endemic diseases, and competition for resources due to English livestock invading native land being key factors to the Native Americans' unease toward Lancaster residents. And similar grievances were felt by Native Americans toward their colonist neighbors throughout New England. The Pokanoket chief and Sachem of the Wampanoag, Metacom, also known as King Philip, listed his grievances as English cheating, discrimination, and pressures to sell land, submit to Plymouth Colony's authority, convert to Christianity, and consume alcohol. Ultimately, war broke out between the English colonists and the indigenous peoples allied with Metacom, including the Wampanoags, Nipmucs, Narragansetts, and Nashoba. the Nashoba people being the people that lived in the area of Lancaster, despite best efforts to maintain peace. In August of 1675, the Nashoba, led by Sachem Monaco, staged an attack on Lancaster, killing 7. This led to Lancaster colonists building several garrison houses for residents to flee to in times of conflict, where they would be better protected during an attack. One of these garrisons was located near the river and was the home of the Rawlinson family. On the morning of February 10th, 1676, the Lancaster raid takes place. The Sachems Monaco and Shoshanim were the ones who planned and led the raid, leading 400 Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag warriors into Lancaster. They then proceed to raze the town, burning the village houses, including the Rawlinson garrison, where at least 36 colonists were sheltering, although some estimates put that closer to 50. Most were taken captive, including Mary Rawlinson and her 3 children. Mary and her youngest child, Sarah, only 6 years old, are injured in the attack. Mary would be separated from her older children, Joseph, 14, and Mary, 10, and Sarah would die from her injuries from within the week. Mary Rawlinson was held captive for 11 weeks and 5 days, and her remaining children were held a month or so longer than that. Her narrative is divided into 20 removes, sort of like episodes in a TV show, detailing the physical, spiritual, and psychological aspects of what her life was like during her time in captivity. The removes also line up with the marches that she was forced to make, from Lancaster into western Massachusetts, then north into what is today Vermont and New Hampshire. Eventually, after meeting Metacom himself, she is returned back to Massachusetts, where she is ransomed for 20 pounds at Redemption Rock in Princeton, Massachusetts, the subscription of which was raised by the women of Boston and paid by John Hoare of Concord, a colonial militia leader. Her social standing as a minister's wife attracted a lot of attention and efforts to ransom her. When she released her book in 1682, shortly after the death of her husband, it quickly became a bestseller, with 2 editions printed in Boston and 1 printed in London within the year. From a literary standpoint, the structure of her story, from capture, initiation, and return, became the norm for future captivity narratives, even as later narratives often took on a more fictitious and embellished narrative. While Mary Rawlinson is Lancaster's best-known captive, there were others taken as well, some of which we have accounts of their time in captivity. Elias Sawyer is possibly the second most famous captive from Lancaster, although he did not write a narrative of his captivity and instead told the story to his children and grandchildren, a story which has subsequently been passed down orally as local legend. Because the story did not take the form of a written narrative and was rather passed down through an oral tradition, it is likely that embellishments have been added on over time based on the teller of the story. I will do my best to provide an accurate account of what I know of the story based on the sources I have read, but I cannot promise that any of it is true. In October of 1708, Lancaster is once again raided by Native Americans. This time, the focus of their attack was the Sawyer Mill at 4 Ponds, near the intersection of Route 62, Chase Hill Road, and Deershorn Road. They were successful in taking 3 captives, Thomas Sawyer Jr., his son Elias, who was 17 at the time, and family friend John Bigelow, who was visiting from Marlborough. They quickly made off with their captives and brought them north through Vermont and into Canada, into what is today modern-day Quebec province. Thomas Jr. apparently made several unsuccessful escape attempts, which really upset his captors. And supposedly his captors intended to torture him upon their arrival at their main settlement near Montreal as payback. However, the governor of Montreal, arriving to inspect the prisoners, as the French would often sell or ransom English captives back to their friends and family in order to raise money for ammunitions, or to negotiate the release of French captives in the English colonies, decided that he didn't want Thomas to die. In inspecting the captives, the governor learns from someone who knows of Thomas Jr. that he is a skilled builder, particularly of mills, which the French do not have in the area at the time. Seeing an opportunity to secure a great asset for the colony, the governor manages to strike a deal with Thomas Jr. The 3 men taken from Lancaster agree to construct a mill for the governor along the river in exchange for their freedom. Pretty easy deal. However, the Native Americans were reluctant to give up Thomas, as they were still set on punishing him for his attempted escapes. According to one account, the victim was accordingly left led forth and actually fastened to the stake, environed with materials so disposed as to effect a lingering death. The savages surrounding the unfortunate prisoner began to anticipate the horrid pleasure of beholding their captive writhing in tortures amidst the rising flames, and of rendering the air with their dismal yells. On a sudden, a friar appeared, and with great solemnity held forth what he declared to be the keys to the gates of purgatory, and told them unless they immediately released their prisoner, he would instantly unlock those gates and send them headlong thereinto. Superstition prevailed and wrought the deliverance of Mr. Sawyer, for they at once unbound him and gave him up to the governor. Fun story, right? The two Sawyers and Mr. Bigelow spent the next year building the promised mill, and upon completion, the elder Sawyer and Mr. Bigelow were released as promised. Elias, however, was kept in Canada to teach the French colonists the art of sawing and keeping the mill in order before being dismissed with rich presents, which I can only imagine what sort of rich presents that was. This is where the accuracy ends and any embellishments likely begin. So as the story goes from here, over the next year, Elias befriended and eventually fell in love with a Native American woman attending a Jesuit school in the area, Owesa, meaning bluebird, who was daughter of one of the local chiefs. Think John Smith and Pocahontas. Before he was returned to Lancaster, he asked Owesa to marry him. She happily agrees and gives Elias a glazed earthenware plate, her most valuable possession. Elias decided he needed to return to Lancaster before marrying Owesa to let his friends and family know that he was alive and well, and to tell them of his happy engagement, and promised to return to Canada to marry Owesa. But upon returning to Lancaster and telling his family what he thought to be good news, his parents were shocked and even mortified to learn of his plans to marry a Native American and return to Canada, which would have been quite scandalous at the time. His parents pressured him into staying in Lancaster and abandoning his plans, and told no one of what his intentions had been. Eventually, he marries a local girl and raised a family in Lancaster, while legend says that Owesa refused to marry anyone else and waited patiently for her love's return. She supposedly made the journey south to Massachusetts, and upon hearing that Elias had married someone else, died of a broken heart near Mount Wachusett. Very sad. The only reason we know of this story is because of Elias. On Elias's deathbed in 1752, he told his children and grandchildren and whoever else was in the room, and showed them Owesa's plate, which he had preserved all that time. The plate and story were passed down through subsequent generations of Sawyers until eventually the plate was given to the Lancaster Public Library in the late 1800s, which is still held today in the museum at Thayer Memorial Library. Elias's story, compared to Mary Rawlinson's, is much more reminiscent of later captivity narratives, the popular literature that is more sensational and fictitious than factual. We do know for a fact that Elias Sawyer was captured and subsequently released, but the romance with the Indian princess is unverifiable. It's possible that it's true, as there are many captivity narratives that mention how European captives would be adopted by native families, becoming a part of their culture and marrying and having children. But it's also quite likely that the romance was fictional and simply makes for an entertaining story, especially given that accounts of Elias's capture, such as the one in the History of the Town of Lancaster, published in 1879, does not mention Owesa. In any case, both Elias Sawyer and Mary Rawlinson's captures are memorialized in town. Thayer Memorial Library is the home to Owesa's plate, as well as a beautiful English oak cabinet that belonged to Mary Rawlinson. And no, she was not carrying it around with her in the wilderness during her captivity. There are also memorial markers placed at the locations of each of their captures. The one for Mary Rawlinson is located across from Old Common Burying Ground near the Thayer Mansion, while the marker for Elias Sawyer is located near the intersection of Chase Hill Road and Route 26. Their stories continue to be of interest, and folks from Lancaster and beyond come to see what they have left behind and hear the stories, both of which are great examples of captivity narratives, although it is obvious that they serve different purposes and have different levels of truthfulness. Captivity narratives, though, were often embellished, whether by the author or an editor or a publisher. Different editions of the same story would contain different details, and occasionally, when multiple people who were held in captivity together wrote individual accounts, their stories would contradict one another. But despite their inaccuracies, they were often bestsellers. Early New England colonists, particularly Puritans, did not read novels as they viewed them as immoral, but a captivity narrative which purportedly told a true account of someone taken captive by Native Americans, sign them up. But But more than serving as entertainment, captivity narratives were used as propaganda, both for religious purposes and governmental. Portraying Native Americans as immoral savages in need of conversion to Christianity was useful to colonial officials in some instances, while in others the narrative provided evidence that frontier settlements needed additional protections. As historian David Minter puts it, first, they became instruments of propaganda against Indian devils and French papists. Later, the narratives played an important role in encouraging government protection of frontier settlements. Still later, they became pulp thrillers, always gory and sensational, frequently plagiaristic and preposterous. Captivity narratives were the equivalent of modern-day romantasy books. Mary Rawlinson's narrative, published in 1682, was colonial New England's fourth wing. And easily would have been a book talk favorite. But captivity narratives as a genre or archetype are still popular today. Think Disney's Pocahontas, Dances with Wolves, even Planet of the Apes and James Cameron's Avatar all have elements and themes in captivity narratives, showing just how popular they are as a form of storytelling. Essentially, audiences today enjoy a captivity narrative just as much as audiences in the 17th century did. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was just wonderful. Can we give Victoria another hand? Please? Really good. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mark Bodanza from the Leominster Historical Society.
Thank you, David. By some quirk of fate or hand of providence, and with no prior coordination, my talk neatly sandwiches itself around Victoria's talk. So fascinating words from Victoria and very entertaining. I start 25,000 years ago when the glaciers covered New England. And what they left behind, of course, was a much different landscape, including here in Lancaster, the Dexter Drumlin. And anybody who's ever walked to the top of that drumlin on George Hill Road, I think would find that it's a very magical place with a 360-degree view of the Lancaster environs. I've often contemplated what it must have been like in 1643 when the English settlers first came to Lancaster and started the trucking station to trade with the indigenous people, or what it was like a decade later when a praying town was established in Lancaster for the conversion of the Native Americans to Christianity. In 1692, there was an Indian attack in Lancaster, and the family that was involved, the settlers, were the Joslins. And in the back of Pine Grove Cemetery in Leominster is this beautiful carved slate tombstone of Peter Joslin, who died in 1759 at age 94 years old, surviving 4 wives. His first wife was killed in 1692 in a Native American attack in Lancaster. It was baking day, and she fended off the attack with her baking shovel as best she could, but she was felled by a tomahawk blow. All of the family was killed, except for one of Joslin's daughters and his sister-in-law. All the male members of the family were out in the field and were spared. The sister-in-law and daughter were taken captive. The daughter died in captivity, but the sister-in-law survived, rumored to have the favor of the Native Americans because of her melodic voice, that they asked her to sing, and she frequently sang to them and spared her life. A few years ago, I have given several tours of that old burial ground. I noticed that the slate had essentially delaminated and had fallen apart, which really bothered me. And I got the mayor to authorize a small expenditure to recreate at least the language that was on that old stone and put it on a new granite stone that we placed next to the old slate. And as those stones often are, they are magical sort of inscriptions and artwork of a generation really absorbed by our mortality. And on Peter Joslin's stone are the following words: "O death, thou'st conquered me, by thy dart am slain, but Christ has conquered thee, and I shall rise again." And that now is able to be read by all on that new granite stone. In 1701, well, I should start by prefacing this remark by this. History is a dynamic process. It's not static. Each generation looks at history or the past through a different lens. And as we interpret the past through the times we live in, the view of what has gone before us changes. And that is very true of what we're doing this evening, which is really changing the mascot of the school based on how we view the Native Americans or indigenous population today versus what we did a generation ago or several generations ago based on Victoria's talk about how they were propagandized for other purposes. What's interesting to me when I wrote my Leominster history book is, of course, Leominster was carved out of the additional grant, which was a conveyance of land by the Native Americans, the Nashoas, the Sachem Tahanto, to a group of Lancaster proprietors in 1701 50 square miles of land. The last limits to history, before I wrote my book in 2019, was written in 1852 by a fellow named David Wilder, who was encouraged to write it after he gave an address to commemorate the centennial of the Leominster Church. In his history, he wrote, "It must be a source of satisfaction to the owners of real estate to know that they have acquired it honorably, paid for it honestly, and obtained a good and sufficient title to it." He's talking about that additional grant. And really, when I studied this and I pulled this all apart, I learned that the Honto had recited in his deed that two other Native Americans had been paid two sums of money, 12 pounds and 46 shillings. What their connection to the Nashoba tribe was is not entirely clear. Why they were paid that money isn't entirely clear. And in the deed, there was a further sum of 18 pounds paid for those 50 square miles. A portion of it was paid apparently at the time that the deed was given. The rest of it was promised to be paid once the Native Americans had gone to our general court, had the order for the conveyance approved by the general court, and the land surveyed. And they were given, I think it was 9 months to complete this task. That never happened. So 11 years later, the white settlers went to the general court, had the deed approved and surveyed the land and divided it amongst the proprietors. So one has to wonder, did the Native Americans get paid any of that 18 pounds? How much of it were they paid? It's of course a fact that's lost to history. So to put it into perspective, if in fact all of the money was paid, doubtful, we're talking a little over 30 pounds. And at that time, that's basically about 3 or 4 head of cattle and a couple horses for 50 square miles of land. So I would submit that even though Wilder said they paid for it honestly and took good title to it and had some pride and satisfaction to it, I'm not so sure that the Native Americans got a very good deal in that exchange. And this is what I mean about how each generation looks at its history differently. Out of that piece of land was carved Harvard in 1732, Bolton in 1738, Leominster in 1740, Stirling in 1781, Boylston in 1786, further divided. Bolton was further divided into Berlin and Bolton. Boylston in 1786, West Boylston in 1808, and finally Clinton in 1850. Quite a few communities for those 30 pounds that the Native Americans allegedly received. I think it's useful, and every time the sort of fall weather starts, I look for a topic to write about. I love writing during the fall and the cooler months of the year. And when I wrote my Leominster history book, I was in a Barnes & Noble store back in 2018 looking for something to write because it was in November. And I was looking at all these books that people write, and I was saying, my goodness, look at all of the titles. And they said when the internet was developed that it would put a death to the writing of books, and of course that's exactly the opposite of what happened. More books are published today than, twice as many books are published today than 25 years ago. And I asked myself, why are all these books being published? And the books are, of course, to entertain. They're to inform. They're to self-help books, all sorts of different reasons that people write. But if truth be told, people also write for legacy. And I said, what could I write that somebody would read, just like I read David Wilder's book several times and used it for research. What could I write that somebody maybe a century from now would actually read? And I said, well, why not take on writing the history of Leominster? So that's what I did. And as I indicated, it's actually the second Leominster history book. There have been picture books and things like that that have been published. And it was a very fascinating and worthwhile adventure for me. And I'm happy I did it. And at this point, if anybody has a question or two, I'd be happy to entertain it. But it's great to participate in this. I'm glad I was invited in Victoria. I learned a lot, and I'm going to have to come to the Thayer Library and do a program at some time in the future. And if no one has a question for me, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
We're going to start this portion of the program with a piece by, it might be known to some folks, but the Siegfried Idyll by Wagner, and it's so un-Wagner-like that it's hard to believe that it's the same composer that wrote, the 5 or 6 hour long operas. My favorite story about Wagner opera is George Bernard Shaw saying, "It's not really so bad as it sounds." But anyway, the Siegfried Idyll was apparently, so they say, written for the birth of his son Siegfried, and the story goes that he had musicians gather on the stairway and play Siegfried Idyll when the young one was brought home. I'm not sure how you put this many string players on a stairway, but it's an interesting story because, and it's a very complicated story if you really get into it because, well, I'm not going to get into it because everything about Wagner is complicated. But this is a lovely little piece that sounds like miniature Wagner, and we think you'll enjoy it. We've enjoyed working on it. This is the Siegfried Idyll by Richard Wagner.
Thank